I thought I had done everything right. I raised my children in a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane in Nashville, Tennessee. For 31 years, I taught 2nd grade at Hillcrest Elementary, and when I came home every afternoon, I still had enough left in me to make dinner, help with homework, and listen to whatever was weighing on my children's hearts that day. I believed that was what a mother did. You poured yourself out, and in return, you built something. A family, a bond, a safety net made of love and history and shared memory. I believed that with my whole chest. My husband, Robert, passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning I held his hand. I won't talk too long about that because even now, the grief sits in me like a stone I've learned to carry rather than put down. What I will say is this. After Robert died, I thought my children would draw closer. I thought loss would remind us all of what mattered. I was wrong about that too. I have 3 children. My oldest daughter lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 teenagers. My son is in Denver. He works in finance, travels constantly, and has been with the same girlfriend for 6 years without any apparent urgency. My youngest daughter lives 40 minutes from me in Franklin. She's the one I thought was closest. She's the one who surprised me most. In the years after Robert passed, I didn't ask for much. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories can be twisted. The mother who demands, who suffocates, who cannot let her children live. That was not me. I asked for Sunday dinners maybe once a month. I asked that they call me back within a day. I asked that when I said I wasn't feeling well, someone take it seriously. I was not asking them to move back home. I was asking them to remember I existed. Slowly, without announcing itself, the contact thinned. My oldest daughter stopped responding to texts for days at a time. When she did respond, it was a string of emojis, a heart, a thumbs up, a smiley face that communicated nothing and required nothing. My son started letting calls go to voicemail and then sending a text that said, "All good here, busy week, talk soon." Talk soon never came. My youngest daughter, the one 40 minutes away, began canceling our standing Tuesday lunches. Once a month became once every 6 weeks, became once every few months, always with a reason that sounded reasonable in isolation, but formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I told myself they were busy. I had been busy once too. I remembered what it felt like to be pulled in every direction, to love someone and still not have the bandwidth to show it properly. I gave them the benefit of the doubt so many times that I eventually stopped counting. The morning everything changed started without drama. It was a Thursday in February. I had been feeling off for a few days, a heaviness in my chest that I chalked up to the cold weather and the fact that I hadn't been sleeping well. I woke up at 6 in the morning, went to the kitchen to make coffee, and felt the room tilt sideways. My left arm ached in a way I had never felt before, and the heaviness became something more urgent, something I couldn't breathe through. I called my youngest daughter first. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called my son. Same thing. I called my oldest daughter. Voicemail on the second ring, which meant she had seen my name on the screen and sent me straight to voicemail. I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs didn't feel reliable, and I called 911. The paramedics came within 8 minutes. My neighbor across the street, a retired nurse named Carol, saw the ambulance and came over without being asked. She rode with me to the hospital. She held my hand in the emergency room while they ran tests and asked me questions and connected me to monitors that beeped in a language I didn't understand. Carol stayed until nearly 2 in the afternoon. My children did not come. The tests showed it wasn't a heart attack, it was a severe anxiety episode compounded by elevated blood pressure and exhaustion. The cardiologist was kind but direct. She told me my body was under significant stress and that I needed to take that seriously. She asked if I had family support. I told her yes, because I was still, even then, protecting them. I was discharged the next morning. Carol picked me up. I called my youngest daughter from the hospital bed that evening, once the initial chaos had settled. She answered this time. "Mom, are you okay?" I told her where I was. I told her what had happened. There was a pause. Then she said, "But you're okay now, right? Like, it wasn't actually a heart attack?" I said no, it wasn't. "Okay, Good, she said. I was going to call you back. I had back-to-back meetings all morning, and then the kids had their thing after school. You know how Thursdays are. I said I understood. So, they're letting you go home tomorrow? I said yes. Good. Okay, get some rest, Mom. Let me know if you need anything. She did not offer to come. She did not ask who was with me. She hung up, and I stared at the ceiling of that hospital room and felt something shift inside me, something quiet and permanent, like a door swinging shut on old hinges. My son texted 2 days later. Heard you had a health scare. Hope you're feeling better. Let me know if you need anything. He did not call. My oldest daughter sent a flower arrangement from an online delivery service. The card read, "Thinking of you. Feel better soon." The exclamation point almost broke me. I went home, and I was quiet about all of it for several weeks. I am not a dramatic woman. I don't perform my pain. But I started paying attention in a way I hadn't let myself before cataloging things I had previously dismissed. The birthday I spent alone because everyone had conflicts. The Thanksgiving, where my youngest daughter's family came for exactly 90 minutes before leaving for her husband's parents' house. The Christmas 2 years earlier when my son didn't come at all and sent a gift card with a note that said the flights were too expensive. I started writing things down, not to use against them at least, not yet, just to see it clearly. Because I had a feeling that I had been telling myself a story about my family that was not entirely true, and I needed to look at the facts without sentiment blurring them. Spring came. My oldest daughter called in April, which was unusual enough that I noticed. She said she and her husband were thinking about making a trip to Nashville in June. I felt something warm stir in my chest. I started thinking about what I'd cook, which restaurants they might enjoy, whether the grandchildren would want to visit the botanical garden. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I had made a pot roast, the same one I'd made for 30 years of family dinners. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic. I had set the table properly, with the good dishes. We ate, we talked, and then, over what remained of the pot roast, my oldest daughter set down her fork and said, "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it might be worth having a conversation about the house." I looked at her. Her husband cleared his throat. Just in terms of thinking ahead, the market in Nashville is really strong right now, and a house this size, with the lot, you do really well. And it might be easier for you to be in something smaller, or a community, something with more support built in. My oldest daughter nodded. We just think it's worth considering. The upkeep alone, at your age, I'm 68, I said. We know, Mom. We're just thinking practically. I looked around the table. My son had joined the conversation via video call on my daughter's phone, propped against the water pitcher. My youngest daughter had driven up for the weekend, and she was nodding along in a way that told me this conversation had been rehearsed before they arrived. They had coordinated. They had planned this visit not to see me, but to discuss what would happen to my house. I said I would think about it. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The good dishes were still on the table. The pot roast was mostly gone. I thought about Robert, and I thought about the woman who had graded papers at this same table, who had helped 3 children with science projects and heartbreaks and college applications at this same table. I thought about what it meant that the people who grew up in this house had driven here, flown here to talk about selling it. The summer passed. I did not bring up the house again, and neither did they, which told me they were waiting for me to come around rather than genuinely engaging in a conversation. My contact with all 3 children returned to its usual thinning pattern. The Tuesday lunches with my youngest daughter resumed twice and then stopped again. In September, I fell. I was coming down the back stairs with a basket of laundry. It was morning, early, and I misjudged the last step. I went down hard on my left hip and couldn't get up. My phone was in the kitchen. I lay on that floor for 4 hours. I want you to understand what 4 hours on a hardwood floor feels like at 68 years old, with a hip you're not sure is broken or just bruised, in a house that is completely silent. I want you to understand that at no point during those 4 hours did my phone ring. Not one of my children called to check on me, not one. Carol found me because she had promised to stop by with something from the farmer's market and let herself in when I didn't answer the door. The hip was badly bruised, not broken. I was lucky. I spent 2 weeks moving very slowly and depending on Carol for more than I wanted to admit. My children were told. They expressed concern through their usual channels. My youngest daughter offered to come by this weekend if things hadn't improved. My son said to let him know if I needed help with medical bills. My oldest daughter sent another flower arrangement. I called nobody that week. I lay in my bedroom in the evenings, my hip aching, and I made a decision. I was not going to be angry. Anger would not serve me. What I was going to do was see the situation clearly and respond accordingly. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled Robert's estate and who I had kept on retainer for small things over the years. I asked her if I could come in for a conversation about estate planning. She said, of course, and we met the following Tuesday, the Tuesday when my youngest daughter and I no longer had lunch. Patricia and I talked for 2 hours. I told her everything, not just the legal question, but the shape of the whole situation. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You're not the first woman who sat in that chair and told me this exact story." I told her what I wanted. I wanted to establish a trust that would protect my assets during my lifetime and direct them after my death. I wanted the house, which I had no intention of selling to satisfy my children's financial planning, transferred into the trust immediately. I wanted my 3 grandchildren, the actual children in this family, to receive the bulk of my estate in equal shares when they turned 25, held and managed until then by the trust. I wanted a modest sum designated for each of my 3 children, enough to be decent but not enough to be a reward. I wanted the rest divided between 2 charities I had supported for years, the literacy nonprofit I had volunteered with since retiring, and the local animal shelter where I had been fostering dogs for the past 18 months. Patricia asked if I was certain. I said I had never been more certain of anything since I signed my name on this house 34 years ago. We spent several more sessions over the following weeks getting everything drawn up correctly. Patricia walked me through every document, every implication, every decision point. I asked questions. I understood what I was signing. On a Wednesday afternoon in late October, I signed my name to a new trust, a new will, and a document that transferred the deed of my home from my name alone into the name of the trust. The house was no longer mine to lose. It was protected, and it would go where I had decided it would go. I did not call my children to tell them. I considered it. I want to be honest about that, because I think the question of whether a parent owes a warning is a real one. I thought about calling each of them and saying, "This is what I have decided, and this is why." I thought about the conversation that would follow, the protests, the tears, the sudden and convenient interest in my well-being that would materialize the moment money was involved. I thought about whether I wanted to spend my remaining emotional energy managing their response to a decision I had already made for entirely sound reasons. I decided I did not. What I did instead was write each of them a letter. I wrote 3 separate letters, each one tailored to the specific texture of my relationship with that child. I wrote about the hospital. I wrote about the floor. I wrote about the Tuesday lunches and the voicemails and the flower arrangements. I wrote about the April dinner and the conversation about the house. I did not write in anger. I wrote the way I used to write report cards when a child was struggling honestly, specifically, and with the belief that honesty, even when it's hard, is a form of love. I sealed the letters. I labeled them. I put them in a folder in Patricia's office with instructions that they be delivered to my children after my death, along with the trust documents. I wanted them to understand eventually, when there was nothing left to argue about why I had done what I did. This is a part of the story I haven't told anyone except Carol and Patricia. The letters exist. My children will read them one day. I don't know how they'll respond. I've stopped trying to manage that in advance. November came. I got a call from my youngest daughter on a Friday afternoon, genuinely surprised me, because she usually texted. She said she and her husband were thinking about hosting Thanksgiving this year and wanted me to come. I said I would love that. She sounded pleased. Thanksgiving was warm and chaotic in the way that good family gatherings with small children tend to be. My grandchildren were everywhere at once, loud and curious and completely themselves. I sat in my youngest daughter's kitchen and helped mash potatoes and felt something close to normal. I watched my grandchildren and thought, they didn't do anything. Whatever happens between me and their parents, they didn't do anything. The trust I had set up would take care of them. Whatever else fell apart, that I had gotten right. December arrived with its particular pressure. My oldest daughter called the first week of December to say they weren't going to make it, for Christmas flights were expensive, the kids had activities. My son texted something similar. My youngest daughter said we should do a small lunch on Christmas Eve. I said that sounded fine. On December 22nd, I received a call from my oldest daughter that had a different quality to it. She asked how I was, which was not unusual. She asked about the house, which I had been waiting for. "Have you thought any more about what we talked about in June?" she asked. I said I had. And I told her the house was no longer something I needed to think about in those terms because it was no longer simply in my name. A pause. What does that mean? I explained, calmly, that I had worked with my attorney over the fall to restructure my estate. I did not give details. I said that the house was now held in a trust and that my estate planning was settled to my satisfaction. Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, we should talk about this. Can we get on a call? All of us?" I said they were welcome to speak with Patricia if they had legal questions. "I'm not talking about legal questions. I'm talking about, this is a family decision, Mom," I said gently, that it was my decision and that I had made it. She called back twice that evening. I let both calls go to voicemail. My son called the next morning. He was more careful with his words, more measured. I could hear him trying to find the angle that would work. He talked about making sure everyone was on the same page. He talked about what Dad would have wanted. I let him speak. When he finished, I told him that his father had wanted me to be cared for and that I had arranged for that to happen and that the arrangement was settled. Christmas Eve lunch with my youngest daughter was quiet. She brought the children, who were wonderful as always, and her husband, who was cordial if subdued. My youngest daughter kept looking at me in a way I recognized measuring me, trying to determine whether I could be reasoned with. She didn't bring up the trust directly. She talked around it, saying things like, "We just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of, and these decisions are so permanent, Mom." I told her I was 68 years old, that I had been managing my own affairs since before she was born, and that I did not need protection from my own choices. She left earlier than I expected. The house was quiet by 3 o'clock. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, in the chair where I had always sat, the one by the window that looks out onto the front yard. The winter light was already going gray and thin. I thought about the 34 years of Christmases in this house, the ones when my children were small and woke before dawn, the ones when they brought home people they loved, the one after Robert died when I had sat in this same chair and thought I wouldn't survive the silence. I had survived it. I had kept surviving things. That was, I realized, the actual content of my life, not the moments when everything was easy and full, but the moments when I chose to keep going anyway. In January, I made another call. Not to my attorney this time, but to a retirement community on the east side of Nashville that a friend had mentioned a few years earlier, one of those beautiful, well-run places with independent living cottages and a calendar full of activities and neighbors who'd chosen to be there rather than waiting to be placed somewhere. I had driven past it once and thought it was for other people, older people, frailer people, people who had run out of options. I scheduled a tour for a Tuesday. The community was called Millstone Creek, and it sat on 12 acres with a small lake and walking trails, and a community garden where residents grew tomatoes in the summer. The cottage they showed me had 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a screened porch, and large windows that let in more light than any room in my house on Sycamore Lane. The woman who gave me the tour introduced me to several residents, a retired physician, a former librarian, 2 women who had been college roommates and ended up there together 50 years later. They were alive in a way I hadn't expected. They were not waiting for anything. They were living. I put my name on a waiting list. My house went on the market in March. I hired a realtor on my own, had the consultation on my own, set the price on my own. I had the locks changed in January, partly for security and partly because I needed to feel that the decisions about this house, who entered it, who didn't, were entirely in my hands. Patricia had recommended it as a practical measure given the trust structure. I agreed for reasons that were partly practical and partly something harder to name. My youngest daughter found out about the house listing through the neighborhood real estate app that everybody in Nashville seems to use. She called within an hour. "Mom, the house is on Zillow." I said yes, I knew. "You're selling the house?" I said I had decided to move to a community that would serve me better as I got older. Why didn't you tell us?" I told her that I had made my decision and worked with professionals I trusted the same way I had with the trust. "Mom, you can't just do this without talking to us." I said I could. I said it without heat, without cruelty. I said it the way you state a fact that has always been true and simply hasn't been said out loud before. She came to the house that weekend, unannounced, with her husband. I saw the car in the driveway from the kitchen window and felt very calm. I opened the door before they knocked. My youngest daughter was upset, genuinely, emotionally upset, and I want to acknowledge that because I think it was real. I think some part of her had loved this house too, in her way. I think some part of her had imagined it would always be here, always be mine, always be available for the visits she kept meaning to make. I think the Zillow listing made something real that she had been successfully treating as theoretical. Her husband was less emotional and more strategic. He talked about the market, about the timing, about whether I had spoken to a financial advisor. I told him I had a team of professionals managing my affairs, which was true, and that I was confident in my decisions. "We just want to make sure you're okay," my youngest daughter said, and her voice broke a little on the last word. I looked at her for a long moment. This was my daughter. I had loved her before she had a name. I had sat by her bed when she was sick and taught her to ride a bicycle and driven her to college and danced with her at her wedding. All of that was true and real, and nothing that had happened since changed it. I said, "I know you do." I said, "I also needed you to be okay when I was on that hospital floor, and when I was on the laundry room floor, and when I sat in a room by myself on my birthday. And I needed you to want to have lunch with me on Tuesdays, not because I had something you wanted, but because I was your mother and you loved me. I needed those things, and they were not very large things, and they did not come." She started to say something. I held up my hand, not unkindly. "I don't want an argument," I said. "I don't want promises. I want you to go home and think about what I just said, and I want you to know that I love you, and that I have taken care of everything, and that you do not need to worry about me." They left. The house sold in 6 days. 3 offers, all above asking price. I accepted the cleanest one and signed the papers in Patricia's office on a Thursday morning with a steadiness I hadn't expected to feel. My cottage at Millstone Creek came available in April. I moved in on a Saturday with the help of a moving company and Carol, who brought homemade banana bread and helped me arrange the furniture in the living room until it felt right. I brought the things that mattered. I left the things that didn't. My new neighbors came to introduce themselves that first week. The retired librarian, a woman named Sylvia, knocked on my door with a plate of lemon bars and stayed for 2 hours talking about books and told me there was a reading group that met every Thursday. A man down the path, a widower named Frank who had moved in the previous fall, waved to me every morning from his porch. The community garden coordinator stopped by to tell me there was a raised bed available if I wanted to grow anything. I planted tomatoes in May. They came up beautifully by July. My relationship with my children is not over. I want to be honest about that because I think the easy version of this story ends with a clean break. The villain children cast out and the wise mother triumphant. That is not my story. My children and I are in a careful, uncertain place. My oldest daughter calls once a month now, which is more than she did before. My son visited in June, the first time he had come to Nashville in 2 years. My youngest daughter and I have had 3 lunches since I moved, actual lunches, where we sat across from each other and talked, really talked in a way we hadn't managed in years. I don't know what they feel about the trust or the house. We haven't spoken about it directly since March, and I haven't invited that conversation because I am no longer interested in managing their feelings about my choices. What I am interested in is whether they will choose to be present, whether they will call because they want to, not because they're angling towards something, whether they will be my children in the full sense of the word, not just in the legal one. The jury is still out. I am watching. I am hopeful, but I am no longer waiting with my whole self. My grandchildren visited Millstone Creek in August. I took them to the lake and showed them the garden and let them pick tomatoes and eat them warm right there in the dirt. My oldest granddaughter, who is 13 and already formidably herself, asked me what it was like living here. I told her it was exactly what I needed. She looked around at the paths and the water and the other residents sitting on their porches in the late afternoon, and she said, "It seems really peaceful, Grandma." I said it was. She picked another tomato and said, "I'm glad you're okay." I am more than okay. That is the part I didn't know was possible when I was lying on a hospital gurney in February, listening to a cardiologist tell me my body was under too much stress. I didn't know that the decision to stop waiting for rescue, to stop treating my own needs as things that required someone else's permission to be real, would feel the way it does. Like finally breathing out after holding it for years. I still think about that February morning sometimes. The floor, the silence, the 4 hours before Carol came. I think about it not to make myself angry, but to remind myself of the exact moment I understood something true. That love, which only flows in one direction, is not a relationship, it is a slow drain. And that there is a particular strength in the woman who sees this clearly and refuses to pretend otherwise, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for herself and, honestly, out of respect for the children she raised. Because you do not help a person grow by absorbing every consequence of their neglect. You help them grow by letting the consequences land. I don't know if my children will become who I need them to be. I don't know if they will look back on these years with regret or with the kind of revisionist clarity that lets people off the hook for things they chose to do. I don't know what they will feel when they eventually read those letters in Patricia's office. What I know is this. I am sitting on my screened porch at Millstone Creek, watching the evening come down over the lake. Sylvia and I are having dinner Thursday. The reading group finished a novel I loved last week, and I talked more in that discussion than I had in years. Frank waved to me from his porch this morning and asked if my tomatoes had all come in. I told him they had. I did everything right. And then for a while I did something wrong. I kept absorbing the wrong things and calling it love. I stopped. And here I am,